It's November 2004, and George W. Bush has just defeated John Kerry to earn another 4 years as the President of the United States.
America has spoken, and I'm humbled by the trust and the confidence of my fellow citizens.
It's not as close as the 2000 election, but what makes it interesting is that it's an election that continues a paradoxical trend that has persisted throughout the US presidential elections for decades.
He is our projected winner as President of the United States.
Here's the map of how the 50 US states and DC voted in the 2004 presidential election. If we order them by average household income, we can see that the states with higher incomes tend to be more Democratic, while the poorer states are Republican. Now here's a chart showing how people with different household incomes voted in the same election. The higher the income, the more likely to vote Republican. The lower the income, the more likely to vote Democratic. So the paradox is, how is it possible that the states with the higher average incomes voted Democratic when the people with higher average incomes voted Republican? Or conversely, how did the states with lower average incomes vote Republican when the people with lower average incomes voted Democratic? To understand this paradox, there are three questions we need to answer. Overall, to what extent do richer states support Democrats? On an individual level, to what extent do richer voters support Republicans? And within any given state, to what extent do richer voters support Republicans? To answer the first question, we can create a regression with the dependent variable equal to 1 if a state voted Republican, and 0 if they voted for Democrats. The control variable is the average household income for that state from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. After controlling for other variables and fixing the prices to account for inflation, we can repeat these steps for the previous elections. Regressions are quite ugly to look at, so we can plot it out in a time series chart. The higher on the y-axis, the more likely it is for a richer state to vote Republican. We can see that, especially from 1976 to 2004, there was a relatively consistent trend of richer states moving away from Republicans and supporting Democrats. If we segmented the data and focused on the Republican-dominated southern states, we see a similar trend, although it's slightly shifted higher. This indicates that, while they overall inherently lean more Republican, richer southern states also displayed a trend towards Democrats. In non-southern states, richer states have historically always been more on the Democratic side, but especially since 1988, we see the same stronger trend to vote more Democratic. So to answer the first question, quite a lot actually. At an aggregate level, and after looking at southern states and non-southern states separately, we can confirm that richer states have been more likely to vote Democratic. We can answer the second question similar to how we answered the first question. We will keep the same dependent variable of whether an individual voted for a Republican or a Democrat. And for the control variable, we will use the personal income for that specific individual, both sourced from the American National Election Study. Again, after controlling for other variables and fixing the prices to account for inflation, we repeat the steps for the previous elections. The time series of this data shows that between 1952 and 2004, higher income people have, on average, always supported a Republican president. And from 1972, this support for Republicans has been consistently high. This is especially true for the higher income people from southern states, with their data points being much higher than the average American. For the individuals in non-southern states, they're more in line with the average, although slightly lower if anything. Regardless, higher income people in these states still had a preference for Republicans. So to answer the second question, quite a lot as well. Richer individuals, regardless of states or southern or non-southern distinction, were more likely to vote Republican. The answers to our first two questions have confirmed what we already knew. Richer states tend to vote Democratic, richer people tend to vote Republican. But how can we make sense of it? We'll skip all the technical jargon and just look at a graph that plots an individual's income against the probability they'll vote Republican, split by what state the individuals are from. In this graph, income is categorized into 5 quantiles, with 0 representing the median, -2 representing the poorest individuals, and 2 representing the richest. The size of the circles at each quantile reflects the amount of people in that income bracket relative to the United States as a whole. Keeping it really simple, we'll only look at 3 states. Mississippi, a poor state that's strongly Republican, Ohio, a middle income swing state, well, at least it was one in 2004, and Connecticut, a rich state that's strongly Democratic. Again, for simplicity and comparability, the slopes of the 3 states are kept constant and the lines are shifted slightly. Just like how it is nationally, within all 3 states, richer individuals are more likely to vote Republican than poorer individuals. This is what we found when we asked our second question. If we wanted to compare at a state-by-state level, we can take the weighted average income level within each state. Doing so reveals a negatively sloped line that shows what we found in our first question. Richer states support Democrats. And it's with this complete chart that we finally unveil the paradox. By displaying both variation within and between states, we can see that there isn't actually a paradox at all. Richer states like Connecticut are overall more likely to vote Democratic, while at the same time, richer individuals within these states are more likely to vote Republican. Maybe not to the extent as a poor individual in a poor state, but we'll discuss that later. Looking at individual and state data separately makes it difficult to make sense of this paradox. But we still haven't really answered the question. Within any given state, to what extent do richer voters support Republicans? Let's go back to that graph we created. Remember that, for simplicity, we kept the slopes of the 3 states constant. If we allowed variability in the slopes, we notice something interesting. The slopes for Mississippi and Ohio rise, whereas the slope for Connecticut flattens. This indicates that income is a bigger influence in voting in poorer states, while it's less so in richer states. We can confirm this by plotting the slopes of all 50 states against the median income in those states. The line of best fit is downward sloping, which confirms what we saw. Income matters more in red America than in blue America. Now, to finally answer the third question, richer voters in poorer states are much more likely to support Republicans, while richer voters in richer states only have a slight preference towards Republicans. This answer is an interesting one. Why is income a stronger explainer of presidential voting patterns in poorer states than in richer states? Well, as someone who's not from the US, I feel I'm vastly qualified to weigh in on this. Without digging too far into it, a person's income affects how they view economic issues such as tax policies and welfare. These economic issues would be more salient in a poorer state, so you'd expect their voting patterns to be more income-based. A poor person in a rich state still has access to things like stronger infrastructure or a more funded schooling system, so their personal income level doesn't play as big of a role. But going back to this graph, even the poorest Mississippians are more likely to vote Republican than the richest Connecticutians. This is likely due to economic issues only pertaining to a small part of a person's overall political leaning. How people view abortion, immigration, or even racial issues also contribute to deciding which candidate to vote for. Looking beyond the 2004 election, the paradox still persists, confusing Americans and election watchers around the world, and with how polarized the US has grown since then, it's likely to continue in the future. It's an influential and potentially misleading aspect of US politics. Depending on which side you or the media focuses on, Democrats are either rich latte-sipping coastal elites or food stamp recipients who live off welfare checks. Republicans are either rich CEO business owners or rednecks who vote against their own interests. Like, it doesn't help that the media love showing red and blue colored maps that don't display voter variation within the states. It's the perfect example of the ecological fallacy, where people think that the average of a certain group represents everyone in that group. So yeah, this paradox isn't really a paradox once you take a closer look at the data, but it's still an interesting topic to take a deep dive into. As we all know, American politics is a safe and civil topic to discuss on the internet. Thanks for watching the video. Hopefully it's been interesting and informative. If you'd like to see all the sources, including the main source, I've linked it all down below. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this, and share the video. Yes. And click here if you want to see something else.